Beneath the ashes of war, long after the gunfire ceased and treaties were signed, there linger shadows that refuse to rest. In the hollow silence of sealed vaults and the forgotten corners of abandoned bunkers, fragments of untold stories wait like bones beneath the earth. They are not the tales carved into textbooks, but whispers carried in coded memos, blacked-out reports, and the faint smell of smoke where evidence once burned. Somewhere between the echoes of victory and the silence of surrender, the hidden war continued, unseen, unacknowledged, unresolved. Here lies a realm of erased missions, vanishing files, and devices tested in secrecy, their traces scattered like puzzle pieces across continents. Step too close, and the line between truth and invention begins to blur, pulling us into a world where shadows speak louder than history. In this silence, a question lingers like a wound that never heals. What was buried, and who chose to bury it? Chapter 1. The Vanished Convoy of Operation Caesar. On February 6, 1945, a German submarine, U-864, slipped out of Bergen, Norway, carrying a cargo under the codename Caesar. Its mission was known only to a handful within the Kriegsmarine High Command and to Reich ministries operating under increasing desperation. The manifest, fragments of which were later decrypted by Bletchley Park, listed mercury canisters bound for Japan, blueprints for jet turbine components, and encrypted packets referencing Neuartiger Antrieb, a term roughly translated as novel propulsion. U-864 never completed its voyage, intercepted and sunk off Fiji Island by the British submarine HMS Venturer. Yet, in the aftermath, records began to contradict themselves. Royal Navy reports described the wreck as containing heavy metallic leakage, consistent with mercury. Divers decades later confirmed this, but they also noted something absent. The weight of the submarine at sinking was markedly below its expected tonnage. If U-864 had been carrying its full cargo, the seabed should have yielded more than toxic remnants. This discrepancy became the seed of a mystery that stretched through Cold War secrecy and beyond. Post-war Allied intelligence examined what became known as the Caesar Papers, decrypted traffic from German naval commands between Kiel, Bergen, and Japanese envoys in Berlin. Among them was a reference to a parallel vessel departing under false registry. Its designation was deliberately obscured, but cross-referencing showed an unexplained gap in the departure logs of the 11th U-boat flotilla. A boat listed as under repair in late January 1945 suddenly disappears from all wartime records. British analysts assumed clerical error, but an OSS memo dated September 1945 noted that Tokyo's naval attaché had cabled Berlin, acknowledging receipt of confirmation of the second Caesar transit. If a sister submarine truly carried half the cargo, the Allies never officially intercepted it. Whether it reached its destination, was scuttled, or surrendered in secret remains unresolved. Declassified British Admiralty files from 1957 reveal repeated salvage attempts around Fiji. Divers under Operation Deadlight, tasked with scuttling surrendered U-boats, had been ordered not only to locate U-864, but to ensure no recoverable documentation or technology remained accessible to Soviet agents. Notes indicate that the wreck's hatches were blown open with explosives, suggesting deliberate destruction of whatever remained. Still, rumours circulated among Royal Navy officers that a crate of documents had been retrieved and flown to Farnborough. No such files appear in MOD archives, though researchers in the 1980s discovered vague references to captured German engineering packets, propulsion-related, buried in the catalogue of R.A. Farnborough's Cold War Research Division. Norwegian divers in 2003 revisited the wreck. What they found complicated the official history. While mercury canisters were visible, other compartments had clearly been cleared long before. Corrosion patterns suggested forced entry within a decade of sinking. Local fishermen recalled British vessels anchored off the coast in 1949, long after the war's salvage operations had ended. If Allied teams had revisited the wreck, it was not to remove dangerous chemicals. It was to retrieve whatever was missing. The mystery deepened with the discovery of a Soviet report, declassified in 1991 after the fall of the USSR. A GRU officer in East Berlin had written in 1950 about materials of German origin, naval transfer, involving advanced turbine research. The memo included fragments of what appeared to be German technical drawings for high-speed marine propulsion, annotated in Russian. Western analysts later compared them to experimental Soviet submarine drives tested in the late 1950s. The conclusion was unsettling. At least part of Caesar's cargo, or its duplicate, may have reached Soviet hands. If so, the implications stretched into the Cold War's naval arms race. The rapid leap in Soviet submarine speed and endurance between 1955 and 1960 puzzled NATO. Conventional explanations focused on espionage within Rolls-Royce or US Navy design bureaus. Yet the possibility that unrecovered German research, shielded under the Caesar convoy, was funneled eastward could not be dismissed. CIA files from the same era make oblique references to Project Seahorse, a counterintelligence effort to track German-origin engineering acquired by adversary powers. The connection to Caesar was never stated openly, but the codename appeared in documents alongside U-864. The human dimension remains shadowy. The commanding officer of U-864, Korvettenkapitan Ralph Reimar Wolfram, was confirmed lost with his crew. But British intelligence intercepted communications, suggesting that certain specialists involved in the cargo's preparation had been reassigned from Kiel weeks earlier. 1. An engineer named Dr. Heinrich Beck vanished in April 1945. No grave, no trial, no record of capture exists. Soviet personnel records uncovered in Moscow list a German technical advisor H. Beck, working at a propulsion institute near Leningrad in 1947. Western scholars have never proven it was the same man, but the coincidence lingers. The Caesar mystery is a puzzle with jagged edges, a war relic tangled in Cold War secrecy. The story appears straightforward at first glance. A submarine carrying forbidden cargo, sunk before its mission could be completed. Yet the gaps in cargo weight, the phantom twin vessel, and the deliberate obfuscation of records suggest something far larger. Did the Germans split their technology, ensuring at least one path for survival? Did the Allies quietly retrieve the materials and conceal their existence for post-war advantage? Or did the Soviets, ever hungry for technological parity, outmaneuver the Western blockade? Each theory finds small fragments of evidence in the scattered documents, but no clear resolution. What survives are hints, cables half burned, manifests half redacted, and testimonies of men long since gone. Divers continue to visit the wreck at Fedje, their lights illuminating a corroded hull that refuses to surrender its full story. Official explanations emphasize environmental hazards from leaking mercury, yet beneath those warnings lies another motive: the persistent desire to control access to whatever secrets may still rest in the shadows of the North Sea. Even in the 21st century, portions of the Caesar files remain classified. Requests under Britain's Freedom of Information Act are met with polite refusals, citing national security. Norwegian authorities warn of contamination, but rarely address questions about prior salvage operations. Historians argue that the story is less about what was carried and more about the pattern it reveals. The systematic concealment of late-war German projects by both East and West, each desperate to rewrite the technological spoils of victory. The Caesar convoy endures as a case study in vanishing truth. Somewhere between Bergen and the seafloor, between Berlin's desperate orders and Tokyo's fading hopes, a consignment of knowledge disappeared into the fog of war. One submarine lies rusting as a toxic tomb, but its twin, whether real or imagined, haunts the archives like a phantom vessel. In the absence of definitive evidence, the unanswered question remains: who truly inherited the Reich's final secrets? And what price was paid to ensure that the answers would remain submerged? Until the locked files open, the story of Operation Caesar remains a dark chapter, suspended between history and rumor, between the silence of the sea and the silence of the archives. Chapter 2: Shadows over Dresden's Silent Factory. The Allied firebombing of Dresden in February 1945 is remembered for its devastation: tens of thousands of civilians incinerated, an entire city reduced to ash. Yet buried in the ruins was a story that never reached the headlines, one that quietly shifted into Soviet hands while the world focused on the flames above. Beneath Dresden, carved into sandstone and reinforced with concrete, lay a network of tunnels known to locals only as Zeppelinwerke. Officially, it was listed as a dispersal plant for Messerschmitt components, moved underground after repeated Allied bombing raids on surface factories. But decrypted OSS cables, now partially declassified, describe something else: a complex of unknown dimensions, housing high-voltage laboratories and storage of classified airframe prototypes. To Allied planners, Zeppelinwerke was a prime target. To the Soviet forces advancing from the east, it became a prize. On the night of February 13th, as thousands suffocated in basements, convoys were reported leaving Dresden heading south toward the Ore Mountains. Eyewitnesses described military trucks, their insignia obscured, carrying sealed crates under heavy guard. A surviving Luftwaffe officer, interrogated in 1946, admitted that these convoys had carried materials vital to Reich survival, though when pressed, he refused further detail. Civilian photographs recovered decades later appear to show flatbeds hauling long, shrouded objects, possibly fuselages or prototypes, out of the city just days before the firestorm consumed it. The Allied narrative that Dresden's war production was annihilated by the bombing has persisted. But these fragments suggest the most critical material had already been spirited away. When the Red Army entered Dresden in May 1945, they secured Zeppelinwerke almost immediately. A Soviet report, once marked Sekretno and released in 1992, noted the discovery of subterranean halls containing dismantled jet fuselages, sealed chemical containers, and power infrastructure exceeding civilian requirements. The report makes repeated reference to uranium oxide residues. Western analysts have debated whether this was a mistranslation or a reference to genuine nuclear material, but the ambiguity lingers. The Americans, arriving later, found themselves shut out. OSS officers noted bitterly that the Soviets have taken control of the site with no intention of sharing. By autumn, the entire tunnel system had been sealed, its entrances collapsed or flooded. Dresden's destruction provided the perfect cover for erasure. Despite official silence, traces of Zeppelinwerke's significance bleed through scattered archives. A 1947 MI6 assessment lists the site among several Soviet acquisition facilities in Saxony, alongside Bleicherode and Nordhausen, where V-2 teams were captured. The document suggests that Soviet jet propulsion research in the late 1940s may have been accelerated by what was found in Dresden. In parallel, US Air Technical Intelligence Command noted unexplained Soviet interest in high-voltage tunnel systems, an obscure reference few understood. The link to Dresden was never stated directly, but the pattern pointed to a convergence of captured German expertise and facilities now under Soviet control. Whispers of Zeppelinwerke resurfaced during the Cold War. In 1962, a defector from East Germany claimed that remnants of the facility had been repurposed as a restricted military research site, guarded by the Ministry for State Security. He spoke of reinforced doors leading into caverns where experimental engines were once tested. His testimony was dismissed by Western intelligence as exaggeration. Yet aerial reconnaissance of the Dresden outskirts did identify unusual ground disturbances consistent with buried structures. Still, no public acknowledgement followed. The story remained buried, overshadowed by the broader narratives of the city's destruction. The question of what precisely was being developed in Zeppelinwerke remains unresolved. Fragments of German documentation refer to Project 512, a designation absent from standard Luftwaffe or Heereswaffenamt lists. The term appears in surviving correspondence between Messerschmitt engineers and the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, often linked to requests for scarce materials such as copper wiring and uranium compounds. Some historians argue it was a prototype for advanced jet bombers. Others suspect it related to power systems for electromagnetic research. Without intact records, speculation fills the void. What is undeniable is that whatever existed there was valuable enough for the Reich to evacuate under fire and for the Soviets to conceal once seized. The erasure of Zeppelinwerke is as telling as its existence. US Army Air Force's official bombing surveys, which meticulously catalogued German industrial facilities, listed the Dresden site as destroyed in raid, yet no photographs accompany the entry, unlike other targets. The Dresden City Archives, painstakingly rebuilt after the war, contain no building permits, no blueprints, no administrative trail for the underground halls. It is as if Zeppelinwerke was designed from the outset to vanish into silence. Whether by Soviet design or by Allied complicity, the paper trail ends in gaps. By the 1980s, a few independent researchers began piecing the fragments together. Norwegian historian Helmut Jacobsen traced testimonies of forced labourers who described working in vast tunnels outside Dresden, assembling airframes and wiring strange equipment. Polish survivors spoke of guards warning them never to look at certain rooms under penalty of death. Their accounts were consistent but unverifiable, lacking physical evidence. In 1999, German construction crews working near Dresden uncovered a sealed concrete shaft. Within were rusted machinery parts, including what appeared to be turbine fragments of unfamiliar design. Local authorities immediately classified the site as hazardous and restricted access. The pieces were quietly removed, destination unknown. The enigma of Zeppelinwerke illustrates the blurred boundary between historical record and deliberate suppression. Was it a jet assembly line moved underground to escape bombing? Or was it something more, an experimental program whose fragments fed the Cold War's technological race? The truth lies hidden under layers of destruction, Soviet secrecy, and the fog of a war ending in chaos. The city above burned so brightly that the tunnels below were forgotten by the public, though not by those who scavenged their contents. What remains today are shadows, photographs of convoys rolling south, intercepted memos describing dismantled prototypes, survivor testimonies of underground chambers humming with power. The firestorm consumed Dresden, but not the questions buried beneath its streets. Zeppelinwerke exists as a scar in the archive, erased by officialdom yet persistently resurfacing in fragments. If the Soviets salvaged its contents, those secrets have long since been integrated into their military archives, perhaps destroyed, perhaps still classified. If Allied intelligence recovered even fragments, those too remain hidden behind blacked-out lines. Dresden is remembered for its fire, but its silence may be just as significant. Beneath the ashes lies a story of hidden tunnels, vanished convoys, and technologies spirited away before history could catch them. Zeppelinwerke was not destroyed, it was concealed, and like so many late-war mysteries, it remains locked not by rubble or stone, but by the will of those who chose to bury it deeper than the flames could reach. Chapter 3: The Erased Prisoners of Unit Epsilon. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, while Allied tribunals in Nuremberg focused the world's attention on crimes of the Nazi state, an altogether different narrative unfolded behind sealed doors in occupied Poland. Buried deep in intelligence annexes and scattered interrogations is the faint outline of a program referred to only as Unit Epsilon. The designation appears in scattered Allied reports from 1946, often in connection with chemical weapons testing, though the files that once described it in detail have been systematically redacted. What remains is a set of haunting fragments, testimonies of prisoners who never reappeared, references to research facilities outside WWII, and whispers of experiments that may have seeded both Western and Soviet chemical warfare programs during the Cold War. The first mention of Unit Epsilon comes from a January 1946 US Army intelligence report titled Captured German Scientific Personnel, Lodz Region. The document, recovered decades later through a declassification request, makes reference to Special Detachment Epsilon, operating under Reich Health Office authorization, engaged in advanced toxicological studies. The language is clinical, yet a marginal note written in pencil by a reviewing officer reads, "Possible human trials. Location unknown." In the same period, interrogations of surviving SS medical officers revealed consistent references to a field test facility near the village of Zgiers, northwest of Łódź. One officer, when asked about nerve agent production, answered evasively, "That was not our department, it was Epsilon." His testimony ends abruptly in the transcript, with several pages marked, "Removed for security reasons." When Soviet forces swept through central Poland in January 1945, they claimed to have discovered a chemical laboratory intact, guarded by German personnel who surrendered without a fight. The facility, they reported, contained sealed glass ampules, chemical stockpiles, and technical notebooks. Yet by 1946, when the Allies attempted to verify the discovery, nothing remained. The compound was bulldozed flat, its foundations buried under soil, and Soviet military police blocked access to the area. This erasure only deepened suspicion. OSS officers speculated that the Soviets had absorbed both the facility and its staff into their own weapons programs. Supporting this, a declassified CIA cable from 1952 refers obliquely to Epsilon origin personnel, exfiltrated Austria, now under Soviet direction. The prisoners connected to Epsilon remain the darkest element of the story. A Red Cross inquiry in 1947 tracked hundreds of missing Polish and Soviet civilians last registered. In camps around Łódź in late 1944, their trail ends at transports marked with the code E, unusual. In German transport records, testimonies from survivors describe fellow prisoners being selected by men in white coats, speaking German with a clipped academic accent. Those taken never returned. In one chilling deposition, a Polish laborer recalled, "They said the men were being sent to help in factories, but we saw trucks going to the woods. We saw smoke from chimneys there that were not for housing." Though his statement was preserved, its accompanying map of the supposed site was removed from the file. In Washington, the issue of Epsilon was discussed behind closed doors. An internal memorandum from Army Chemical Corps, dated 1949, states, "Recovered documentation indicates German progress on nerve agents was greater than admitted publicly. Evidence points to field trials of tabun derivatives on live subjects under Unit Epsilon supervision." The memo concludes with a warning. Soviets may now possess not only material, but methods, owing to capture of Epsilon staff. None of this information reached the public domain, overshadowed by the more visible atrocities prosecuted in Nuremberg. Unlike the notorious Unit 731 in Japan, Epsilon left behind no defendants, no photographs, no formal trial. It was erased by convenience or design. The Cold War saw occasional echoes of Epsilon in NATO exercises. During chemical warfare drills in the 1960s, training materials referred to E-protocol scenarios, an internal term unexplained in official glossaries. A retired NATO officer later admitted that E-protocol was shorthand for scenarios modelled on certain German origin case studies. Asked if these related to Unit Epsilon, he declined to answer. The secrecy was so total that even references became abstract, reduced to single letters and code names divorced from context. By the 1970s, researchers attempting to trace the fate of German chemical warfare units discovered the void around Epsilon. Standard sources listed well-documented facilities at Dehernfurth and Raubkammer, both associated with production of tabun and sarin. Yet every path toward Łódź ended in missing files or blacked-out lines. Independent Polish investigators found locals who remembered a guarded area outside Ziers during the occupation, but the site itself had long since been forested over. One elderly farmer recalled seeing German trucks unloading drums there in winter 1944, guarded by SS men. After the war, Soviet soldiers cordoned off the same location for weeks, then abandoned it without explanation. The fragments suggest that Unit Epsilon was more than a footnote. If it conducted human trials with nerve agents, it represents one of the Reich's most damning crimes, one never prosecuted. If its staff were absorbed into Soviet programs, then its legacy may have fed directly into the vast chemical stockpiles fielded by the USSR in later decades. Equally disturbing is the possibility that Western intelligence also exfiltrated select personnel, quietly granting immunity in exchange for knowledge. A 1951 CIA biographical file on an unnamed chemist of German origin working under contract in West Germany includes the annotation, "Possible E connection." The name is redacted, the page edges scorched, as though deliberately damaged. The absence of victims' records haunts the story. Unlike concentration camps, where deportation lists and death registers provide grim documentation, Epsilon's prisoners disappear into silence. Their identities remain obscured, their fates swallowed by a program designed to vanish. For families searching after the war, inquiries ended in frustration. Some received letters stating that their loved ones died in transport. Others were told nothing. The International Tracing Service, which painstakingly assembled Nazi transport records, flagged dozens of unexplained E designations. None have been decoded. Unit Epsilon remains one of the war's darkest blank spaces. Its name surfaces in interrogations, then disappears in censorship. Its victims exist only in fragments of testimony. Its staff may have walked free, absorbed into post-war programs on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The absence of a trial was not an accident. It was a decision. As chemical weapons became central to Cold War strategy, the moral reckoning with their origins was quietly buried. Epsilon was not erased by history. It was erased by those who found its secrets too valuable, too dangerous, or too inconvenient to expose. Today, the woods outside Zgierz hold no markers. Beneath the soil, foundations may still lie, poured in haste by prisoners whose names are lost. Declassified fragments point to a crime against humanity, never acknowledged. The silence surrounding Unit Epsilon is its own indictment, a reminder that some of the most disturbing truths of the war remain hidden, not because they were forgotten, but because they were deliberately concealed. In the shadows of Nuremberg, where justice was meant to shine brightest, Epsilon vanished into the dark. Chapter 4: Operation Gladio's Forgotten Eastern Cells. In the decades after the Second World War, NATO's secret stay-behind networks, collectively referred to as Operation Gladio, became a source of scandal across Western Europe. Investigations in Italy and Belgium uncovered arms caches, covert training, and connections to right-wing paramilitaries. Yet scattered documents suggest there was another chapter, one that never reached the public hearings: the existence of so-called Eastern cells, clandestine structures established in the occupied zones of Germany and Czechoslovakia during the late 1940s. Unlike their Western counterparts, these cells were not designed to resist a Soviet invasion. They were created to watch, infiltrate, and disrupt Red Army logistics in territories already under Soviet control. The first traces of the Eastern cells appear in British Foreign Office cables from late 1947. A memorandum marked Secret Distribution Limited lists a program to recruit former Wehrmacht officers with Slavic language, proficiency for field observation roles. The cable is careful not to name the program, but includes a curious annotation: to be folded under existing Gladio structures where applicable. At the time, Gladio had not even been publicly named. This was language for insiders. Cross-referencing shows that the individuals recruited were not random ex-soldiers, but intelligence-trained personnel, many of whom had served in the Abwehr's Eastern Front divisions. Their knowledge of terrain, dialects, and Soviet procedures made them valuable, if expendable, assets. By 1949, Soviet counterintelligence files reveal unexplained disruptions along Red Army supply routes in occupied Czechoslovakia. A report from Smersh, declassified after 1991, documents a series of train derailments and storage depot fires near Pardubice and Ostrava. The report blames reactionary elements and foreign agents, though no arrests were recorded. Within NATO archives, a set of operational digests from the same months describes success in intelligence penetration, minimal exposure, plausible deniability, maintained. Analysts today interpret this as a confirmation that sabotage was not accidental, but orchestrated by clandestine cells. Yet in the official narrative of Gladio, which emerged after the Cold War, no mention is made of Eastern operations. It is as if the existence of these networks had been deliberately excised. One of the most telling documents surfaced in 2004, when Italian researchers uncovered a 1951 memorandum from the British War Office referencing Eastern contingents. The memo states, "Initial deployments indicate results beyond expectation. However, exposure risk remains high, especially given Soviet reprisals. Recommend compartmentalization and denial of NATO involvement should assets be captured." This stark phrasing underscores the expendability of the recruits. Unlike Western Gladio operatives, who were often tied to established political parties and paramilitary groups, the Eastern cells consisted of displaced Germans, Poles, and Ukrainians, men who had already lost homes, families, and nations. They were deniable by design. The human cost becomes clear in oral testimonies recorded after the fall of the Berlin Wall. In 1993, a former Czech railway worker described seeing two German men speaking fluent Czech with an accent, tampering with track switches near Hradec Králové in 1949. He reported them to local militia, but within days, Soviet officers removed the case from Czech jurisdiction. The men were never seen again. Another account from East Germany recalls unexplained disappearances of former Wehrmacht officers in Saxony during the early 1950s. Families later learned through whispers that their relatives had been caught spying for the English. No trials were held, no verdicts issued, only silent vanishings. The disappearance of the Eastern cells from the official Gladio story likely reflects more than simple secrecy. By the mid-1950s, NATO was seeking détente with newly established Warsaw Pact states. Acknowledging sabotage operations inside Soviet-controlled territory would have been a political disaster, undermining Western claims of purely defensive intent. Thus, the Eastern cells were not merely abandoned, they were erased. Their missions ceased, their surviving members either exfiltrated or written off as casualties. Soviet archives hint at captured operatives sent to gulags, but the numbers remain unknown. Western files close the chapter with cold euphemisms. Assets dissolved. Program concluded. No further record. There are hints, however, that fragments of the Eastern networks survived. A 1967 CIA field report from Vienna describes contact with a former E-cell courier who had fled Czechoslovakia during the Prague Spring. The man, identified only as R, claimed to have carried coded messages between German émigré communities and Western handlers in the early 1950s. His testimony includes references to a training camp near Regensburg, supposedly overseen by British officers. Whether R embellished his past to secure asylum is impossible to confirm, but his details match earlier, independently sourced fragments. The absence of Eastern cells in public memory is striking, particularly given the controversies surrounding Gladio in Western Europe. While the exposure of arms caches and connections to extremist violence caused outrage in Italy and Belgium, the silence about Eastern operations was total. Even parliamentary inquiries in the 1990s, which sought to uncover the full scope of stay-behind networks, avoided the subject. When pressed, officials responded that no records existed, yet researchers have documented deliberate destruction of files in the late 1950s, specifically relating to special operations east of the Elbe. The timing coincides with NATO's increasing emphasis on nuclear deterrence, rendering sabotage missions less relevant and more politically toxic. The moral ambiguity of the Eastern cells mirrors that of Gladio itself, but with even greater brutality. Men who had fought for a defeated Reich found themselves recycled as instruments of a new war, one fought in shadows. Their fate was never meant to be remembered. Families of missing operatives received no recognition, no pensions, not even the false comfort of a death certificate. In Eastern Europe, their activities were branded as criminal terrorism. In the West, they were never acknowledged at all. They became ghosts, their existence hinted at only in the margins of classified files. Today, researchers attempting to reconstruct the history of the Eastern cells face a wall of silence. Soviet archives confirm sabotage, but not sponsorship. NATO archives hint at recruitment, but redact details. Oral testimonies add color, but not proof. The result is a narrative suspended between shadows, much like the missions themselves. These men operated in occupied lands, striking unseen, and then vanished as if they had never existed. To acknowledge them now would require unraveling decades of denial, and perhaps admitting that the Cold War began with acts of aggression the West was never willing to confess. Operation Gladio remains synonymous with hidden armies and political manipulation in Western Europe. But its forgotten Eastern cells remind us that the Shadow War extended further into the occupied territories where the lines between victor and vanquished blurred. In the silence left behind, we catch only echoes. A derailment in Pardubice, a fire in Ostrava, a vanished officer in Saxony. The rest lies buried in files that were never meant to survive, erased in the name of expedience, leaving only the faint outline of a network that lived, fought, and died in silence. Chapter 5. The Silent Files of Tokyo Bay. In August 1945, as the Empire of Japan prepared its unconditional surrender, US naval intelligence seized hundreds of crates from warships anchored in Tokyo Bay. They were catalogued hastily, marked NAVTEC-JAP for the Naval Technical Mission to Japan, and shipped to the United States for analysis. The official story records these as ordinary technical documents, manuals, research notes, aircraft designs. Yet among the shipping manifests is a reference to materials marked Fugo. To the public, this meant the balloon bombs Japan had already launched against the US mainland, a desperate and largely ineffective campaign. But buried in internal reports are indications that Project Fugo included far more than paper balloons. In classified memos, it was linked to atmospheric platforms, high-altitude delivery systems, and propulsion experiments whose scope remained hidden for decades. The first anomaly comes from a Navy inventory log dated September 2, 1945. It lists Fugo-related atmospheric research, 36 crates, sealed, Tokyo Bay. Next to the entry is a notation in red ink, priority transfer to Fort Detrick. Fort Detrick, at that time, was the hub of American biological warfare research, not balloon engineering. Why would Fugo materials be routed there? The question becomes sharper when compared with a later Air Technical Intelligence Command report in 1947, which admits certain Fugo-derived concepts were being examined alongside high-altitude reconnaissance balloon projects. This phrasing, cautious and bureaucratic, suggests the Japanese had advanced ideas about stratospheric flight, perhaps beyond what historians credit them with. Where those crates went after arrival is itself unclear. By 1948, no official records list them. An Army filing note states simply, disposed of. Yet a 1954 memorandum, declassified by accident in the 1990s, refers to Fugo platforms in relation to Project Moby Dick, the Air Force's high-altitude balloon reconnaissance initiative. That memo carries an annotation. Japanese Orig Dokuno translation, C. F1245. No such file is listed in archives today. The implication is that the United States quietly absorbed Japanese atmospheric research into its early Cold War surveillance efforts, then erased the trail. The mystery deepens with the testimony of Lieutenant CMDR Robert S. Harkins, who served on the USS San Diego during the surrender. Interviewed in 1963 for an oral history project, Harkins recalled watching teams load crates from surrendered Japanese vessels. They were guarded differently, he said. Not like the regular tech loot. These had MPs all around. And the officers checking manifests weren't Navy, they had Army patches. Harkins admitted he never saw inside the crates, but the secrecy struck him as unusual. His interview transcript was initially classified. Only in 2008 was it released. By then, Harkins was long dead. Soviet sources add another layer. A declassified GRU intelligence report from 1946 describes American seizure of Japanese atmospheric weapon projects, potentially useful for long-range delivery of chemical or biological agents. How the Soviets obtained this information remains unknown, but their own experiments with stratospheric balloons in the late 1940s appear to have accelerated soon after. This suggests that Moscow, too, believed the Japanese had been on the cusp of something more advanced than paper balloons drifting with the jet stream. If so, then the disappearance of the Fugo files was no accident. It was the beginning of a silent arms race fought in the skies far above public awareness. Eyewitnesses in Japan provide faint but chilling corroboration. Residents of rural Ibaraki Prefecture recalled being cleared from their villages in 1944 for what they were told were balloon tests. Yet some described machinery that did not look like balloon production, reinforced sheds with cables running into the ground, and unfamiliar engines delivered by truck under heavy guard. One man, interviewed in the 1970s, swore he saw a long tube, like a cannon, being tested at night, with strange flashes that lit the sky. His story was dismissed as misremembered trauma, but when cross-checked with surviving Japanese engineering sketches, the description is uncomfortably close to designs for high-altitude launch systems. The erasure of Fugo from history is thorough. Official Japanese records speak only of the balloon bombs already known, emphasizing their failure. American post-war surveys echo the same narrative, yet researchers who have traced the NAVTEC JAP reports note glaring absences. Dozens of crates catalogued in Tokyo Bay have no surviving translations, no summaries, no disposition records. Some of these crates, marked with a simple F, vanish from the chain of custody entirely. It is as though they were swallowed whole by the classified apparatus of the US military, never meant to resurface. Why the silence? One answer may lie in the early Cold War scramble for strategic advantage. In 1946 and 1947, both the US and Soviet Union were desperate for long-range reconnaissance methods. Satellites were still a dream. High-altitude balloons offered the only near-term solution. If Japan had indeed made strides toward controlling balloon flight in the jet stream, or even experimenting with rudimentary atmospheric platforms, both superpowers would have considered that knowledge priceless. Acknowledging it publicly, however, would have raised disturbing questions. Why had the Allies underestimated Japanese research so badly? And what crimes might have been tied to those projects? Fort Detrick's involvement raises another possibility that some Fugo materials concerned not flight alone, but delivery of agents in the upper atmosphere. Such a revelation would have been politically intolerable in the years just after Hiroshima. The secrecy endured for decades. Even in the 1980s, when investigative journalists pried into Operation Paperclip and the absorption of German scientists, almost no attention was given to the Japanese side. Unit 731 received some exposure for its biological atrocities, but Fugo remained an obscure footnote, safely framed as a failed balloon campaign. Only a handful of researchers questioned why so many crates seized in Tokyo Bay were routed to facilities like Fort Detrick and Wright Field, where top-secret aerospace and biological programs converged. Those questions have never been answered in any official capacity. Today, fragments of the story continue to surface. A Freedom of Information Act request in 2009 uncovered a stray index card referencing Fugo atmospheric experiments under a file code that no longer exists. In 2014, Japanese researchers excavating a former airfield near Tsukuba discovered concrete foundations inconsistent with balloon sheds. more suited to heavy equipment. The site was quickly sealed by local authorities, citing safety concerns. The files remain locked, the artifacts hidden. What little escapes into daylight only deepens the enigma. The silent files of Tokyo Bay are a reminder of how wars end, not with total disclosure, but with selective erasure. The Allies controlled the narrative, choosing which stories to tell and which to bury. In this case, crates of research material vanished into classified vaults, their contents repurposed for Cold War projects that left no trace of their origin. The Japanese scientists who created them were either executed, imprisoned, or quietly co-opted. The victims of their experiments, if any, left no records at all. What remains is the outline of a secret swallowed whole, one that resurfaces only in redacted lines, forgotten testimonies, and scattered photographs of crates that should not exist. Somewhere, perhaps in a government warehouse or in the ruins of a sealed bunker in Japan, fragments of the missing files still remain. Until they are found, the story will persist only as a ghost in the archive, a reminder that even in victory, not all truths were liberated. In the silence of Tokyo Bay, the crates were loaded, the manifests signed, and then history closed its pages. What they contained, and why their trail was erased, remains a secret still floating in the thin air above. Even in the stillness of archives, the story never truly ends. The files may remain sealed, the names struck through with ink, the evidence scattered across oceans and deserts. But silence has its own gravity, pulling us closer to what was meant to stay forgotten. The deeper we look, the more the ground shifts. Facts dissolve into fragments, fragments into whispers, and whispers into echoes of something larger than memory itself. Perhaps the war never ended in the way we were told. Perhaps it only changed its mask, slipping into hidden corridors, traded between shadows and locked cabinets. And perhaps in the cold hum of secrecy, the past is not past at all. It waits, not to be understood, but to remind us that what is unseen is often the most dangerous, and that the silence of history is never empty, but filled with the weight of what we were never meant to know.